Hello, I'm Michelle Leduc-Catlin. Welcome to episode 8 of season 2 of Trued Up, the podcast that invites you to be the change. A lot of people have put a lot of effort into sharing factual information over the past few years, but much of the intended audience has either not seen it, denied it, or dismissed it altogether. Despite the noble intentions of millions of truth seekers and freedom fighters, billions still don't know that they were subjected to unprecedented psychological warfare that predetermined what they would think and what they would do. Many of those who haven't figured out what's afoot sense that something is rotten in the state of Denmark and every other state. Some will be unreachable, too invested in their identity, their attachment to their opinions to change their minds. But many are moving closer to the truth. It's easy to give up on those who have been so willfully and sometimes vehemently blind, and many have resigned themselves to leaving those behind. But behavioral expert David Charalambous has devoted himself to reaching people, and it's working. David not only practices what he preaches, he shares and teaches his experiences and his effectiveness, which is why he is my guest today on Trued Up. How do we even start to talk about the area of expertise that you are here to talk about?
How do you eat an elephant?
Right. Let's start with the first bite, shall we?
One bite at a time, yes.
Yeah. So let's first start with your wheelhouse. What is it that you do, and how did you come to do that? And then we'll get into its direct relevance and importance to.
Well, I guess back in March 2020, I realized that something was very wrong. So I'd had up to that point over 20 years training and courses and study in psychology and behavior, communication. And I considered myself to be pretty good at debating people and would be able to get my point across well. And all of a sudden, everything stopped working. And it didn't make any sense. And that's what led me to study a lot of behavioral science, which I've been, spent the last 5 years studying in depth, and propaganda, mind control, all of these things to understand, because it was such a curious thing that I was witnessing, and it was so important. And like most of the viewers, you could then start to see a trajectory of where this was going, and it wasn't good. So pretty much I dedicated my time to creating this project and trying to show all the groups that were speaking up how to speak up more effectively.
What were you doing before all of this?
Well, going back a number of years before that, I was consulting to a number of big companies, and one of the last ones really put me off. It was, we're moving I think it was like 600 million offshore. And then I suddenly realized, I could see in the projects I was working on that it wasn't good for society. So I left there. And then I was working on a project actually with Bruce Lipton, who was the author of Biology of Belief and a few other things. So I was kind of at a limbo, wondering what to do next, because I had become aware in 2004 a lot of how the world works, the banking system, etc. Because I met Ed Griffin in Sydney. So my view of the world, model of the world, had been shattered a long, long time ago. And back then, if you spoke to anyone about any of these subjects, they just called you a conspiracy theorist. It was just, and then of course, there's millions of conspiracy theorists now which really is just a term for anyone that questions the official line. And that's why it was created.
I first of all have to acknowledge, I love that you, because I think it's so important today. One of the things that's happening, okay, I just started 3 sentences. I will finish one of them. One of the things that's happening today is people, I think, are becoming in tune with their values and seeing that, and people are no longer able, or more people are no longer able to live in that disparity between what they say they believe and what they do. So I love that you see that this work that you were helping to promote was not consistent with your values. And so I just first want to acknowledge that. Now, I want to dive into the work that you are currently doing, which has tremendous value. And it is the work of propaganda and how people think. And before we started recording, you said something about how people think. I'd like you to start with that.
Yeah, well, one thing that I've realized over the last 5 years, and what has happened is that by studying this, I mean, to a degree that I never thought I would ever study anything really, I realized that how I saw myself and how I thought and how thinking works wasn't how I thought it was. So what I had to then do was to reanalyze myself and do a lot of what people call shadow work, belief work, etc. And it highlighted to me that a lot of the things that I thought about myself were not true. And then when there's a real need to be completely honest with oneself, because what you touched on when you see a disparity between what you think and what you feel often is the disparity, is the difference between that there's two processing systems to our thinking. And this is what Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for. And they call it system 1 and 2. And one of them is slow and deliberate, it's the logical. And the other one is the quick, fast, emotional reaction. Now, what happens is that because we don't realize what's going on outside of awareness, we end up being in a false sense of security. For example, if I said to you, do you decide to get angry? Okay. Because most of the time, or most people, the way we've been educated is that we're in full conscious control of ourselves. And that would be, we want to believe that. We want to believe that we've got full willpower. And the truth is that when you understand this, you end up getting more willpower, because then you realize, for instance, I had a real epiphany quite a while ago. I was driving along. Somebody pulls out in front of me. Actually, it was someone pulled out behind me, and then they drove really close to my back bumper. Okay, this angered me. And then I realized that that was just an automatic response, and that my emotional state was dependent on this person that I'd never met before and probably unlikely to ever meet again. And there's something about that. I thought, hang on a minute, do I want to be handing over my emotional state to random strangers? And that's the thing. When then I had to own up, I didn't decide to get angry. Okay, it was an automatic response. It was a conditioned response. And there are times to get angry, which are when you're threatened in a situation where you need to use the anger as the energy to sort of fight back. But in that situation, it was a redundant response because, let's face it, a lot of people don't drive very well. So if I was in conscious control there, my decision would be to drive wherever because my first response was to piss him off, basically. And even look at that, I assume it's a guy. I don't know. It could be it could be anyone driving the car. But my first inkling was to slow down to annoy him, and then I realized I'm still a prisoner of the situation. So ideally, what I want to do, if he could be speeding somewhere with a pregnant wife or whatever, all I want to do is just pull over and let the guy by. Okay, so he can go about his way and I can go about my way. But to go where I'm going unimpeded by what's going on. So all that noise, does that make sense? But when I really thought about that, then I looked at a lot of the way that I would be and how much of it would be, if I had a choice to respond a certain way, how much of it was I responding in the way that I'd like to respond? For instance, I'd noticed years before when I was looking into this work, how when a relationship had finished, how I was acting quite needy at times. Okay. And then it really gets you to go back and say, okay, well, where's this coming from? Because it's coming from past experiences. And what's really interesting is that when you resolve those past experiences, your behavior will change. But you can't really do that consciously. That's what this illusion that we can control ourselves consciously is just an illusion for the most part. You look at, and the reason for this is that a large part of our thinking actually happens before we're aware of a thought. Okay, if I say to you, what color is your car? Okay, or what color is your front door or whatever, you would then be able to tell me. But did you consciously go and access that memory? No, it's done automatically for you. Okay. So then when we're sitting there, a lot of the time when we become aware of something, and they've shown this on, imaging machinery where the brain is doing something before we're aware of it. Now that is the big issue, is that whatever's going on outside of awareness, if that's tampered with, you wouldn't know. That makes sense. So
yes, and I really like that you used the car analogy, because first of all, anybody who drives can relate to that. So it's very real. So I like that. And more than I like that, I want to expand on that, because here's an example where clearly we know there's no conscious response, there's no powerful response, there's nothing empowering about the situation. It is an automatic, it is happening to us.
yes.
And we like to think that we are responding based on choice, but mostly we are reacting based on what we perceive as happening to us. So I want to expand from there to get into some of these, what would you call them? Groupings,
Concepts, maybe.
concepts, distinctions. Yes, I'd like to get into some of that. And at the same time, map them onto what's happening today so we can continue that relevance of the car.
Sure. So the easiest way to explain that is if you take ourselves and we split it up into 3 parts of ourselves. That's the easiest way I can explain this. It's a very good analogy. A lot of the books will split it up into 2, but I think it's much better to split it up into 3. So imagine your conscious mind as a rider, your unconscious mind is a horse, and both of them have got a map. Okay. Now, the reason that my unconscious mind responded with anger, because something in the map says that situation is a threat. Now, my best guess from knowing myself is that it was a lack of respect. Okay. And that lack of respect is a threat to the ego. And that's when you'll get the anger. I mean, just say to someone they're wrong and just watch what happens. Criticize anyone and watch their response. Yeah. Even if you're completely right, I've come to the conclusion that if you want to reach someone, you have to completely remove criticism from your commentary, because people don't respond to it at all well. So the unconscious mind in that situation, i.e. the horse, had in its map of the world had this equals a threat, and that's why it responds that way. So imagine using that metaphor, and the horse pretty much controls behavior, whereas the conscious mind is the judge. Okay, it's to look and it's to assess, etc. So look at someone wearing a mask. If you can convince them, into the map, so the map is a representation of knowledge. So if you can convince them on the map that it says mask equals safety, or mask equals the right thing to do, whatever it might be, the unconscious mind is then going to feel compelled to wear the mask. That makes sense. Now, what's really interesting that goes on is that the conditioning is so strong now with the propaganda and the media that what they're interested in is controlling your behavior. And they don't really care, I would say, in some instances, what the person thinks, because what's going to happen is the conscious mind is going to rationalize. So you'll have a number of people, as you mentioned, a number of people voted a certain way, but can't really explain why. That's because their unconscious mind's been hacked. Now, you'll see this, like when an alcoholic wakes up every day, they're convinced they're not going to have another drink. Okay, so the conscious mind's going, well, I need to stop drinking, so I'm just going to stop drinking. And then the unconscious mind at some point during the day will feel such a compelled need to do that. And you'll see that around any addiction or any compulsion, is that there's this disassociation between what the person thinks they're going to do and what they actually do. That makes sense. And so much of marketing is based on this. I mean, look at, you take one of the fast food restaurants, the Arches. Okay, it's garbage. I mean, I wouldn't eat it if you paid me, but a lot of people, and even a lot of people in what we could call the freedom movement, still shop there because they feel compelled to do so. And the reason for that is that the advertising is linking happiness and pleasure to that thing. Okay, but that happens at such an unconscious subliminal level that you'll just feel compelled to go there. And then the rationalization will be, well, I've had a tough day or whatever. And that's why I said we're going to be really honest with ourselves, is if we can, and one of your questions actually on the email is really this: introspection is limited. Okay. Because this map where you attain loads of your knowledge is actually hidden from us. And it's not hidden from us for what Freud had suspected was repression. That certainly is a possibility, but most of it's for efficiency. So imagine if I said to you, I took my dog for a walk. Okay. If you had to remember every memory you had around dog and walk, okay, you couldn't. There's thousands and thousands and thousands. So what your brain does is it gives you just a quick summary of those terms so you understand what I'm talking about. That makes sense. So you don't consciously access all the map because it's just not feasible. There's too many things going on. That makes sense. So what the brain does is it's very, very efficient at taking shortcuts. But because the people in propaganda know the shortcuts that we take, that's how they hack us. Give you an example. If you're on holiday and you walk past two restaurants and one of them's busy and the other one's empty, where are most people going to go? Which restaurant? To the busy one, because you just assume, well, if the locals are in here, then it must be better than the other one. Okay, now that's a fairly decent heuristic, and we do that all the time. For instance, if you go to a carvery, have you noticed how everyone's polite to the person giving out the food? Okay, because you somehow think that the more polite you are to that person, they're going to give you a better piece of the food or more or whatever it will be. And we just do that automatically. That's what we understand context and we operate that way. Now, with that restaurant analogy, imagine that one of the owners has phoned up all his cousins to get them round for the day just to make it look busy. And then they've somehow put other people. So someone stands outside the other restaurant saying, oh, you don't want to go in there. I had a bad meal or whatever. So reality has now been manipulated to manipulate your perception of which restaurant is better. Okay. So when you understand that that's a heuristic, and that heuristic is just a general rule of thumb, then if they manipulate every general rule of thumb, then the person observing whatever's going on is going to build a very different understanding than actual reality. So the authority one is a classic, just say all the experts agree on this. Well, I'm pretty sure that isn't the case.
Wow. Okay. So there's a couple of things that I'm already taking away from that. And one is actually compassion. Compassion for the times when I react in a not productive way,
Yeah.
that the horse feels threatened.
Yeah.
And so there is that reaction. And that afterwards, in some ways, the best I can do is afterwards examine the reaction, look at where that came from. As you said, I could go back to the past where it first happened, so that I can alter my experience the next time. But at the
Yeah.
very least, if we could get that, it would give us permission to change our minds.
Yes. See, because that's such a key point. But it was actually Krishnamurti that said observation without judgment is the most important skill to master of oneself. Now, that's one thing that I've had to cultivate, is that, I've struggled over the last couple of years with losing weight, and to realize that, because of the amount of stress that I'm under, all the projects I'm working on, is to realize that that's something that I'll go to as a habit. And I've solved a large part of it, but not got it down completely. But then there might be this voice that comes in, well, you should know better, et cetera, et cetera. Now that, funny enough, people don't realize, but that's a product of conditioning as well. So once you realize, where is that voice? Is it my father? Is it my mother? Is it my teacher? Is that really me? Because this next part that I'm going to mention is so key to all of this, which is, and this is a line from one of the studies, which is, a repeated external message will often turn into an internal value. So what happens is, and Darwin called them pseudo instincts. So it's not a true instinct. It's been conditioned into us. So most people have a pseudo instinct to comply with authority. Okay, now that's not inherently there. Also, people think we're actually egalitarian by nature, but after a few years of schooling, that gets drummed out of us. So what you've got, I'm of the opinion now that most of the way that we see the world is actually not our true selves. It's been conditioned into us. Now, that's an uncomfortable position to realize, but it's actually very freeing, because then you realize, hang on a minute, this critique in my head, that isn't my true self. I'm not, and that's when you talk about compassion, because you suddenly realize, well, I've got to unravel this some. And that's when you start to understand how the world functions. So the observational learning is so key. So if you put a child in a situation, the first and foremost thing is the child's going to try to survive. That's what the brain is designed to do. It's not designed for truth. It's designed to survive. So it's going to work out, what do I need to do to make it? It might be, I mustn't show my emotions. It must be, I mustn't be weak, or whatever it is. And what happens is that those become the rules for life, which might be, if the child was in an abusive home, might be a way to survive, but that's going to severely impact the relationships growing up. So, but these rules sit on that map, and it almost operates as a control room. Now, with the education that we have, for the most part, it's all about do as you're told, listen to authority, and you're a good boy or good girl. Don't, and you're a bad person. Now, I've had a number of clients which have literally had the belief in that map that we only got to by asking very specific questions, which is, I am bad, or everything's my fault, or whatever it is. Now, that's obviously not true, but if it's on the map, it will feel true. And that's when you get this difference, and it's called disassociation. Now, what's really interesting is when you talk to a person that I, for want of a better term, will call indoctrinated into the narrative, okay? When you're talking to that person, they have a series of very interesting beliefs. One of them is that their viewpoint is correct. The second one is that they have certainty in that. The third one is that anyone that doesn't believe, that's an idiot. And then if they don't believe it, an idiot, they deserve to be abused. So you have all these really very interesting, and that's totally not scientific in any way. So the scientists that act that way, and there's a lot of them, because I've engaged with them on Twitter and X and all the other places, if you challenge their thought process, they will basically abuse the hell out of you.
I want to stop there, because I think so many people are afraid to speak out because of that abuse. And yes, I have had the same experience. I will be very politely offer some information, and it's immediate personal attack. It's almost never even about the information.
No,
it's about what an idiot I am. Right. Well, here's this study, and I will say, I'm not sure why you have to make this personal, or I'm not sure where your hostility is coming from. I try to address that thing, but I really believe that people don't speak out because they know that's coming.
Well, that's a big part of the effect of propaganda. And it is a big challenge. Now, you can release a lot of the emotions around that. And it's really important to take care of yourself and have breaks between, if you do talk to these people, because the indoctrination is so strong. And because that information they're indoctrinated with sits on the map that they're not able to see, they're operating as though it's completely true. Now, what's very useful is to have a couple of, one, you've got to be polite, because the biggest single factor to whether someone listens to you is what side they think you're on, even if there are no sides, because that's all the studies show that if somebody labels you as the out group, you have zero chance of reaching them. So the first thing you've got to do is break their caricature of you. Now, what's the interesting thing about this is that when you talk to people that watch all the same media, it's like you're talking to the same person. Okay, because the responses are so predictable. I've been copy and pasting them into and keeping tabs of them, and it's incredible. You challenge them on something, and then they're like, they will just come out with some random statement that's totally unconnected. Just like, if you said to them, you challenge them on the COVID vaccine, they go, how's polio working out for you?
Yeah.
Like what the hell? But they're so common and predictable, and there's not that many of them. It's very rare that somebody will have a comeback that I haven't seen before. So what I start to do on my posts is that, particularly if it's on one of the science groups, I put at the bottom, a laughing emoji is not a scientific response. Amusing me is not a scientific response. And that tends to reduce that reaction significantly, because what you've got is, again, the same with the car. Their abuse of you is not, they're not thinking. It's a conditioned response. Now, this is the power of the propaganda to use fear and other methods, is that once you get the horse in charge, it's all about safety, fight or flight, all these things. So the person's not rational in any way. When the horse is bolting, as it were, which is what happens when they get into that emotional state, they're not thinking. And everyone has the right to respond in kind. If someone's being an absolute arsehole to you, then you have every right to respond that way. And I sometimes will. Most of the time, if I can stay conscious, I won't, because I realize it's not going to get me anywhere. But every now and then you'll talk to someone that's just, will just astound you at their stupidity. And not stupidity, the stupidity that they think they're critically thinking. So I'm pretty sure that when I look on my map, there's going to be some things on there that are not correct. It stands to reason that I can't know everything correctly. I know that to be true. So it's quite wise to be humble and then, evaluate things. But I think it's fair to say that the people that have looked into the information and data much more are going to have a much more accurate picture of reality than those that have just believed what they're told. That seems fairly reasonable.
I have a question for you, and I hope this isn't it doesn't take us off topic, and because it's a personal question, so it's completely self-interested. But I'm going to say all the time, am polite. The problem, and sometimes that's enough for me. I'm strictly talking about my experience, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the time that is enough. But sometimes I am then left with the anger that got triggered in me.
Yes.
At the injustice, and I don't know what to do with that. I won't put it out publicly because I know it doesn't forward the conversation.
Yeah.
What do you do with that?
Well, I use a number of techniques for that. So the Sedona method is very good. EFT is very good. There's a number of NLP techniques. So proper somatic meditation is good. See, most people, most of what we're told about meditation, when you look at someone like Reggie Ray, it's really the true meditation is to sit with the feelings in the body. Okay. Right. You try and quiet the mind. Good luck. It's like trying to, hold onto a wild animal. Now, I work a lot with clients, and I've had clients that are ex-cult members, etc. And I have all range of clients from, athletes to just business people, mums and dads. And I've been doing that for about 20 years. So you get a really good intuition about what happens and where emotions and feelings come from. And a lot of the time, the emotion will come up because it's banging into a belief system. Now, a lot of the time, anger is, when people are disrespectful to us. When you realize that, for want of a better term, you're just talking to their automated response. So it's like a voice, it's like you phone up and you get their voicemail. They're not aware. Now, every now and then, people will suddenly start to become aware, and they've got a lot of reasons not to be, because it's quite a challenge to do so. But you see, when that alone does reduce a lot of the anger, when you can see that they're not really talking to you, they're talking, and that's the irony about this caricature, they're talking to the caricature of what the media has told them someone with your beliefs are. And that's the irony, that so much of, and I'm going to use the term truth movement loosely, and I would describe that as the people that have seen through the charade of what this was called a pandemic. Okay, any critical thinking person must know that there is so many contradictions in that that requires investigation at the least. And if you go further and further, you realize that there's some pretty horrendous things that happened. Anyone that's not doing that is not a critical thinker. But the people that are indoctrinated to a T will tell you they're critical thinkers.
Yes, that was going to be my next question. But
Yeah.
everybody thinks they're a critical thinker.
Yeah, well, that's disassociation. So I mean, there's actually 7 official terms of what critical thinking is, and we're about to run a series of workshops on this. And I also think that critical thinking isn't enough. And the reason for that is I'm working on a project with someone in Canada, and I recommended them a book to read, and the book is written. It's called How Minds Change by David McCraney. Now, it's a really good book, but when I was talking to the gentleman on the project, he said, but I pretty much disagree with his belief on everything. And I said, yeah, so do I. Because you can be very good at a process and a method and spotting many things. But if you have one of those variables on that map is incorrect, it doesn't matter. So let's say that you've got someone and they're working with masks and they're excellent at understanding hundreds of things about a mask, but they believe that it works when it doesn't work. So they've got all that information. So that's a bit like when you get people talking about the economy. They talk about all these thousands of bits of information, but they miss the basic point that the banks are printing the money. So it's almost like this information outside of awareness. And that's when you start to see this concept of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, you can do an incredible job of that, but if it's hitting the iceberg, it really doesn't matter. And that's what you see with so many of these things, is that people will be able to, quote you hundreds of different facts and everything else. But the point is, does the whole line of reasoning make sense? Because there's so many of the topics, you only need one part of it to be such a lie to realize that it can't be true.
Well, and I can see how that is used against the truth movement, because people on either side, again, if there are sides, but people who become rigid about what they believe, even if it's true, you can throw one incorrect fact into
Yes.
the alternative narrative and then dismiss the whole thing. But also for the people who are in the truth movement, they can then buy into an incorrect fact because it is aligned with their narrative.
Yeah, especially if it's something that we want to believe.
Yes.
We want to believe people are good. We want to believe that people are on our side. So yeah, it's easy to do. I think it's very wise to judge people by their actions and not their words.
So much of the manipulation and mind control exerted on the general public to comply with unscientific mandates and protocols wouldn't have worked if we understood the power of programming and how it's used by governments and media. Not just as a whole, but individually. Until we understand our own personal programming, our own susceptibility, we are at risk. This is why I became a certified self-sabotage coach, studying with world-renowned mind control and health expert Jason Christoff. I could see my own susceptibility. I learned about how the programming all around us worked to keep me from thriving physically, intellectually, financially. We're living in extraordinary times, and we will either succumb to the constant negative programming or we will become alchemists and transmute our challenges into victories. We will become the people we've been waiting for. If you're interested in working with me, either in a group or one-on-one as a coach or a speaker, email me at michelle@gatheryourwits.com and let's have a conversation. Now back to my conversation.
One of the greatest tools of propaganda is basically to attack people. And what happens is that, this term controlled opposition, which is really interesting. So if you talk to somebody that's unaware what's going on and you say something they don't like, they're pretty much going to call you a conspiracy theorist. Okay. But when you do that to someone in the truth movement, a lot of the time the response will be controlled opposition. Okay. So, and of course, if you were, let's say there's a group of people pushing propaganda and trust me, the level at which they understand how the mind works is truly baffling. When you look at the studies, I mean, that study that I mentioned, where it was how authority gets people to believe things that aren't true just because the person's saying them. The references in that study are like, there's 107 other studies referenced there, from how to get people not to go onto marches, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you know, this isn't like, people will talk about Solomon Asch studies, you know, with the line length studies, so a lot of people have come across one or two of these studies, and they talk the Milgram study, etc. But here's the key: when you think about Solomon Asch study, where people would answer the incorrect answer just because everyone else did, so they didn't stand out from the group. Mm-hmm. What is the implicit association there? Now, I'll explain. You know, the implicit association is key, because that's what's on the map that controls our behavior, but often won't make it to conscious awareness. Okay. So if someone answers wrong on purpose, what does that tell you about them?
They're a liar?
Well, that's
Oh, you mean the person who in the experiment, the person who
yes, the person in the experiment. So if they feel compelled to answer the wrong answer because everyone else has,
that they want to fit in.
Exactly. So it's really important. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to get rejected from the group. Now, these are all very basic survival instincts, okay, that are really played on. Now, the implicit association there is that their behavior is driven by the need to fit in, okay, the need to, right. And people don't really start to think about that. Where does that come from? So when you look at Milgram's experiment, the need to do what authority tells you, okay, I think is a conditioned response from schooling. Okay. Yes. And it's such a strong conditioned response that people would literally push a button to potentially kill another human being.
Yes.
It's a pseudo instinct. Does that make sense? And it comes from this competitive, you know, this repetitive message. Do as you're told, you're a good boy. Do as you're told, you're a good citizen.
Well, it's more heinous than that, because the more that's reinforced, the more we're trained to believe that we are not inherently decent, that we are not inherently egalitarian, that we don't care about each other.
Well, there's a lot of that's going on. I also think there's a social engineering project to divide the male and females to, you know, I can see so much evidence of that. See, a lot of this is, you know, there'll be an agenda, and it's what's the agenda's end. You know, when you look at things like semantic drift, for instance, which is the changing of the meaning of a word.
Yes.
Okay. So when you change the meaning of the word woman to include men, the word woman effectively loses its meaning. And therefore, you know, and I think it was Confucius that said, when words lose their meaning, people lose their freedoms. So, of course, people don't know what they're talking about anymore. And, of course, it's so interesting is that when you get someone to believe something, you mentioned that rigidity, and that's really key, is that once someone believes something, that's like a walked path. So if you imagine you get to a new field and there's 2 foot of grass, when somebody walks the pathway, that becomes pretty much the pathway that everyone walks. Yeah, because it's the path of least resistance, and that's what happens. So there's some very interesting studies around this where they would get people to adopt a certain position, even if it was against what they previously believed. And then they really defended that position. Once they start defending it, then they had reasons to defend it, and it really took on a life of its own. They had another study where they would ask people their opinion. They would come back a few months later, pretend the person that had answered the opposite opinion, and ask them to justify that. And most of them did. So what you've got is that a lot of people really haven't thought clearly about what their opinions are on things, and then they just defend things. I mean, you ask, if you go on social media and you see the people that are somehow defending, you know, the right of men to call themselves women and go into bathrooms, like, I mean, it beggars belief. But you know, they will just start attacking you and doing all these things, and you're a nasty person, and JK is a horrible person, all that. But then you just say to them, can you explain to me? Now, here's one of the key things. If you ask them why, which incidentally is a question you never want to ask an indoctrinated person, because all you're going to do is you're going to get them to believe what they believe even more. But if you ask them to explain what they believe.
Hold on. I want to understand that. You'll get them to believe what they believe even more. Is that because they've now found the justification for what they believe?
Yeah, because basically most of their beliefs, well, they're not even beliefs, they're pseudo. It's a house of cards.
Mm-hmm.
There is no reason. Okay. And that's what's interesting. So when they condition someone, okay, so let's say you condition someone to have a burger when they feel down. Okay. Okay. So there's no reason. It's an emotional response. Okay. And then you ask them to explain their reason. They're going to look for reasons. There are no reasons. Okay. And that's why there's a very famous quote that says, the heart has reasons which reason knows nothing. And that so much of our emotions that we can't explain, but often we try to, and we do quite a poor job when we do that sometimes. But what it is that when you ask them why, what you've got is a table floating in space that has no evidence, it has no reasons. But when you've asked them why, they then start to pull from the buffet of excuses that the propaganda provides them, and then they start to put those under the belief. So now it's got some substance to it. Okay. But when you ask them to explain what they believe, then they suddenly hit this term, and I'll say it, but it's relatively simple. It doesn't sound simple, and it's called the illusion of explanatory depth. Now, what it is that we think we know what we know more than we actually do, and it's what the brain does. It always gives us that false sense of security around a lot of things, and that's why the term, if you want to understand something, try to teach it to someone, because you'll then see your gaps in your own knowledge. So we created a website at the beginning of the pandemic that tried to sum up the complex parts of it and give a one-page summary. And I thought I knew a lot of it, much more than I did. And it's only when I tried to write these documents that I realized I had gaps in my knowledge. And that's a very useful exercise, because then once you do find the gaps in your knowledge, you can fill it in. So that's why debate is always very useful. But then if you say to the other person, can you explain, like even when someone says to me, like I make a comment, they go, oh, you're an effing idiot. Okay, can you explain to me how you come to that conclusion? Because then they realize it's an emotional reaction. There's no reason, like, because that's what's really interesting. And funny enough, when you say that to people, when you ask them to explain their line of reasoning for abusing you generally, it will go blank. Or, you know, depending on the topic, they'll find something like, oh, you're endangering people. And then you say to them, okay, so how am I doing that? So there's effectively that part's the Socratic method, where you just keep asking for what's the legs to this table? What's the legs to that table? There are none for the most part. Okay. And that's why the propaganda, for me, its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, is that it's built on a house of cards, but it's all connected. So once they see the key to this is trust. Once they stop trusting the media, it's pretty much game over for most of the propaganda. Okay. And I would say to people, don't watch media, because it's very hard to protect yourself when you're watching something, because there's too many moving parts. But when you read it, you can be very sort of cautious of what you're reading.
Right. There's some distance there. You can, you don't get quite so pulled in. You can be more,
you can slow it down, because because that's what's interesting about this, is that at its base level, the brain has limitations. So when you think about your phone number, okay, I'm pretty guarantee that you've broke it up into 2 or 3 chunks, okay, because you can't see, the consciousness is limited. I think it was 7 plus or minus 2. So you can only think about between 5 and 9 pieces of information at any one point. Okay. So because of that, when too much is going on, the brain actually just goes, whoa, and it goes into this receptive mode. And they've shown that when, you know, those stock channels, when there's that ticker going underneath, they've shown that then there's more than one of that. The brain just goes into this, I don't know what to do. And it goes into this very receptive mode. And what they've shown is that when you've got product placements in movies, the ones that people don't notice has a very positive effect on the sales. Okay. If you notice it.
That's amazing. The ones that people don't notice. It also explains why, you know, you have those news channels where they've got weather in one corner and a ticker on the bottom. And I mean, I don't know how people watch that, but you're right. And they're far more receptive.
Well, that's what's really this next piece of information is quite hard to get your head around at first, but it makes perfect sense when you think about it from how we would, how the brain would function. The information that you're not consciously aware of contributes to your decision. So they've replicated this study in so many different ways, but one of the most fascinating ones is there's people in a supermarket and there's two wines on the display. One's French, one's German. When they play French music, the sale of the French wine goes up significantly to like 75, 76%. And when they play the German, the same. Now, what happens is that when the people are quizzed whether the music had any effect, most of them didn't even notice the music. And the ones that did said, no, it had no effect. It's having an effect. See, the thing is the brain. So think about you're at a party. It's called the cocktail party effect. Okay. And there's 4 or 5 conversations going on around you. And then suddenly someone mentions your name. Okay. What happens? You notice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But how can you notice? Your brain must be listening to all the conversations.
Right.
Okay. In order to flag. So what you've got, this is when you get onto the key bits now. So what you've got is a part of the brain called the reticular activating system, and it's the filter of the mind. Okay. It's like the security guard at the door. Say, so when that conversation mentions your name, the security guard goes to the conscious mind, hey, look, this is important. We need to look at this. Now, what that reticular activating system does via the beliefs that are in your map is it filters the world. So if you believe adverse reactions don't happen, even that this is what they've managed to do, which is a work of art. They're on the side of the box. They're listed as in hundreds of pages. Yet emotionally, to the person, they don't exist. They don't happen. It's a coincidence, and it's something else, and it's psychological and whatever, which again is not logic. It's emotional. No. Okay. Even though that's there, like because in that RAS system, they don't exist. The person just filters it out. That makes sense, and that's why that RAS system, that's the gatekeeper. So that's when the person is looking at any information. This is what confuses most people. Imagine that you've got Jane and Joe. Okay, Jane has not been indoctrinated into any specific belief around COVID. She's well aware that there's lots of censorship. She's well aware that there's lots of people saying things that aren't true, and that the Pfizer are doing their thing, all these things. But Joe, her brother, completely different viewpoint. He's a maths professor. He believes the media tells the truth, all these things. Now, when you place a fact between the two people, that fact is going to be interpreted completely differently. And that's what we don't realize. And the reason for that is that the implicit associations, and all that is that what the person believes unconsciously, okay, provides the context. The context provides the meaning. Okay, so what you notice around funny ones is that if there's a man snoring, okay, the reaction is going to be, oh, that's annoying. But when my dog snores, everyone thinks that's so cute. Okay? It's the same thing, but the context is different and it has a completely different meaning. So that's why so much propaganda is about manipulating the context, because once the context is set, that person's mind becomes so rigid, okay, that all the information is going to go through the same filtering process.
So you just gave me a different context for one of the disparities around the jab, and that is that every drug that is advertised on TV has a long list of side effects listed, yep. Right? And yet you could have a celebrity saying, get the jab, be part of the community and all that. And nobody questions that you can't even talk about potential side effects, even though every single drug always lists its potential side effects. So yeah. By creating the context of these people that are promoting community and are people that are that people admire. You've completely changed the behavior.
Yeah, well, what they're also doing is the operant conditioning. So that's the conditioning that, and I've got a table on my other screen here, which is the operant condition that happened during the pandemic. So operant conditioning, just to quickly give it some background, is how animals are trained, basically. So it's all about carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments. Now, humans are trained the same way. Now, when you get abused when you speak up, that's training you to avoid speaking up. Okay, that's what happens. You're right, because we instinctively move towards pleasure and away from pain. But this is shown, corporations know this. The easier the buying process is, the more pleasurable it is. And then therefore that will dictate more repeat business. Okay, the brain wants ease and it wants pleasure, and it moves away from pain. Now, for that, anyone that mentioned anything wrong with the jab, literally what they would do is they would chastise them on TV, and it would be, oh, how dare they, disgusting and whatever. And then the people learn very quickly, oh, I mustn't do that. Okay, so what they're doing is they're training the horse, they're training the emotional reaction. Now, even though logically it makes no sense, it doesn't really matter, because the logic isn't what controls your behavior. It's primarily the horse. Primarily your emotions control your behavior, because you can't really be trusted consciously to do things, because there's consciousness is between 7 and there's 5 and 9. You can't really do many things consciously. I mean, try driving a car consciously, like truly consciously, where you're working at every single gear. I've got to put 30% of my weight on that. You can't do it. So by conditioning people to respond, that becomes automatic. Okay, so what you do is it's conditioned with, so what and with operating conditioning, the carrots and sticks, there's 2 of each. There's the giving of the carrot and there's the taking of the carrot. There's the giving of the stick and there's the taking of the stick. That makes sense? So what you have is that if removing the stick is removing a lockdown. Mm-hmm. That's easing the pressure. Now that tends to be one of the most powerful ways to manipulate people. Okay, as you put them under a pressure and they do as they're told, you release the pressure. Okay, that's one of the most powerful. So all through COVID, pretty much, or the whatever we call that, what happened, there was basically 4 different types of ways to force compliance. There was giving people rewards for doing as they were told. There was taking away rewards if they don't do as they're told, even their freedom. Okay, which, if you've got rights, it can't really be taken away if it was truly a right, isn't it? Or there's removing the punishment, like easing the boot off your neck if you do as you're told, or there's giving you the stick if you don't, which are the fines, violations, and all these things. The people aren't aware that most people are doing as they're told because of those 4 things. Yeah. Like truly, obviously they used a huge amount of fear porn to get people to comply. But if we look beyond the sort of logic of things and look at the emotional manipulation, a number of people, when you're talking to them, were like, I just wanted it over. That's why they caved in and got the jab, a lot of people, which, for me and other people that felt that this was really dangerous, that was the sort of hill. There was nothing they could have done to force this. But if let's say you're somebody that trusts the governments, trusts these institutions, I can imagine a scenario where they thought, oh, I don't really want to do it, but it can't be that bad, et cetera, and they just went along, which is never a good thing. But whilst not agreeing to it or thinking it's sensible, you can at least probably understand that they don't see how dangerous that could have been, why they would have just complied. And there was a number of people that, there was one person that said, oh, I thought they'd leave me alone. And it's like, well, did you think you could comply your way out of this? So, but it's understanding the manipulation. When it's emotional, a lot of the time it goes on outside of awareness. And we've all had that experience where someone's tried to control us and manipulate us, and we didn't see it at first. Okay. And then all of a sudden it sort of becomes very obvious, and it's very uncomfortable. And I think that's a situation that a lot of people are going to realize with their governments.
What is your thought? Because I know you might be the only person, or certainly one of the only people that I know that has actually had people change their mind. I know that, you were talking about people saying, well, I thought it would be over. And so when the mandates were over, people thought, oh, well, thank God that's over. And they don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They've moved past it because they would have to confront all of that, right?
Yeah.
What is my question? So my question is,
How minds change?
what's that?
How minds change?
How minds change. Yes, because again, people just want to either not talk about it or talk about being right. So how do you change minds?
Yeah. So basically what you've got is you're changing the map. That's what changing the mind means. So if somebody realized, and see, the other thing is, I do believe that everyone in the truth movement has affected someone positively. Okay. The thing is, you often don't see it. It's rare that you're literally, I've had numerous a time where I've known exactly what I wanted to get someone to see, and I've been able to get it. And you literally see a visceral track. I mean, I do it with my clients all the time. I know specifically what the belief is. And if I can introduce information that contradicts that in a way that they reinterpret it, that collapses. Okay. We've got processes that can literally, because people don't realize the implicit association of I'm not good enough. That's an implicit association. I, not good enough. Those two things have been associated together. Now, that's one of the biggest manipulations, is that most people feel powerless. So what you've got is that's just conditioning. Okay. Now, the thing is, it feels real. Okay. It's not. People know they're good enough, but it feels real. And of course, it's the feelings that drive the behavior. So what I know from all this research is that when something changes on the map, change will occur. Okay. Now, the best way to change the map is stories, metaphors, and questions. Giving them facts doesn't work. I mean, that's clear. The evidence is very clear. It will work for people that have authority. So a doctor, literally, I know a doctor during the lockdowns would go out to people wearing masks and explain to them why it wasn't good, and they'd take them off because she was a doctor. So all of that context, that persuasion was already there. The way to do it is stories, metaphor, and questions. So basically what you've got is that most people's understanding of most concepts, if they're indoctrinated, is based on a house of cards. Okay. Now, if you can get information into there that starts to, wobble that or change it, then what you can see is a really quick cascade. I mean, I have had situations where I think I might have mentioned one where I've had a 5-minute conversation with someone, and then I've seen them a month later and they've completely destroyed their whole belief system based on that one conversation. Now, so I think about what it is that someone believes. And if you imagine it is a house of cards, then what are some of the really key pillars? Okay. Now, for me, media is one of them. Yeah. And you'll hear people say things like, now here's an implicit association. So think, when I'm saying implicit association, I'm talking about is it's not explicit. It's not clearly easily available. It's implicitly hiding in the mind, and it's just an association, i.e. this equals this. So people will go, if that was true, it would be on the news. Think about that.
I will actually take that a step further. Having worked in television for over 20 years, if they see it on TV, it's true. It doesn't even have to be the news. There is something that happens when people are watching TV. There's a credibility and authority they give it.
Yeah.
And I heard it in my own family. Well, I saw it on TV, but I work on TV, and just because I've said it doesn't make it true.
It is incredible. I mean, I've found it quite bizarre at times that every now and then someone will ask for a selfie just because they've seen me like on a podcast, and I'm like, well, I'm not a celebrity. I don't like, you know what I mean? But there's something about once you're on that thing in the corner. Now think about the levels of conditioning that have to be there for that to be. Now that's what's really interesting about this, is that you know, when Socrates would just literally keep asking people to explain themselves, and it just destroys the whole conditioning because it's not based on reason, it's just emotion for the most part. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is when, now, and I try and stay away from this topic, but I think it's much easier now, and that's vaccines in general. So there's so much, I mean, I doubt there's anything that has as much propaganda as vaccines. Maybe statism, i.e. that governments, that we need governments, is probably the most propagandized thing in history. If I go, oh, but you need them, it's like, well, tribes survived for thousands of years and they weren't, you know, there's obviously lots of tension between them or whatever. But basically this thing that we need, a group of people, you know, taking all our money and sending it off to foreign lands and stuff like that is required for some reason. But coming back to the vaccines, like, the propaganda is truly incredible, but you only need a few pieces of information to really pull the rug under their feet. Now, this next bit, I'm going to try and explain this simply, but what it is that when you create dissonance in someone, okay, and the dissonance is really quite straightforward, is it's two things that don't match. Okay, and the term comes from, I think, music, isn't it? Where there's this dissonance, there's just not this resonance between them. Now, that could be a belief and a behavior. It could be two thoughts for me, because a lot of time they say between a belief and a thought, or belief and behavior, but I think it happens at so many different levels. So if that difference becomes their idea and your idea, okay, then they got a choice between changing their idea or just rejecting yours. What are they going to do?
Of course,
okay,
pick theirs. It's easier.
Exactly. But when you create dissonance with two ideas in their mind, that's right. when the mind has to change. Okay. So
give us an example.
So an example is, so shots. if you go on any of the science, basically any of the Facebook groups now, from what I can see, are just propaganda vehicles for Big Pharma. Pretty much nearly all of them is pumping out all this, and they pump out stupid things like, they have like a Simpsons scene and they have the guy on the left and it'll say 10 years of academic training, and then the guy on the right, some guy from YouTube, and thinks he's correct and all that. So it's all this, it's this constant reinforcement that only the experts can have an opinion, and if you haven't had 10 years of training, well, 10 years of indoctrination into that belief system, you can't have an opinion. But if you were to read all the studies and then just point out the error in their thinking without it being external. So as an example, they post, you know, vaccines don't cause autism and here's how we know. Okay. And then you get all the people going, yeah, these idiots and whatever. Okay. Now, if I go, oh, they do or whatever, then, you know, but all I say is, like, how many of those vaccines have been studied for their link to autism? Okay. Now, as it turns out, only one of them has. So 1 out of the 28. Now, that contradiction's so large and it's so inherent in their system. It's not me, okay, because that's there, okay? And that stuff like that really jars them, because it's in their system.
It's inconsistent with their own thinking, or even exactly. You know, the fact that Kennedy's just called for placebo testing on every vaccine. I am sure most people don't know that there is no placebo testing on vaccines. I mean,
they just assume it.
They assume it, right? We assume. In fact, and I will call myself out on this one, and I think this is one of the gifts of the last 5 years, is the ability to re-examine everything. I wrote something early on about the COVID shot. So I didn't get it. I wasn't about to get it. I was presenting the scientific evidence why I wasn't. But I started the article as a hook with getting my tetanus shot, because I said, I'm all for a vaccine with a proven track record. What? No track record. I'd never looked at a study, never looked into the ingredients of the shot. And yet the assumption was so firm in my mind that
that is a classic example of implicit association.
Yeah.
It's implicitly implied that that's there. Now, that's what's interesting, because I've spent a lot of time with, you know, various scientists and doctors in the freedom movement, and they've now, like, gone, oh my God, I've actually having to go back to all of them and look into the data. And a lot of them have come out, like Pierre and Paul Merrick, etc., and said, actually, it's all a house of cards.
Yeah.
And that's my opinion. And I'm open to people, challenge me on that. But what's interesting is when you talk to these, I mean, the pro-vax professors on X are just, their attitude, they have such certainty, they're nasty, they're righteous, all these things. That's not science.
But you see
You
that
know?
yeah, and I think if one way for people to start critical thinking is to notice who is having the emotional response.
Yeah.
If you have facts, if your answers are correct, you don't need to get hostile, you don't need to attack. You can simply present the facts. It's when you don't, or even have an inkling in your mind, some doubt that what if I'm wrong, that people turn to hostility. Because
Yeah, well, that's where being humble is really sensible, and that's again that there's so many soft skills required to really get someone to look at something.
that's really great. So let's talk about soft skills, because as I said, I feel that there is opportunity. And I mean, I see it. So many people, so many of us. I mean, I was pro-vaccine, right? But then I have I even have a book right here on my desk that was given to me to pass on to somebody else, written from the perspective of someone who was pro-vax, who did research for their own children, and is presenting it in a very scientific and compassionate way.
Yeah.
And I see that these soft skills are some of the skills that people are developing. Those people who are being effective, people like you who are being effective in first changing your own mind and then changing other people's minds, or even, because I know it's not our responsibility to change people's minds, but to support people in thinking.
Facilitate the process.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
see, the thing is, it's a lot of the time you're not going to witness the change. You've got to trigger a curiosity is one of them. I mean, there's a number of tips that I could give. I'm trying to give it's like a golf swing. Yeah, everything's just got to be in a good enough proportion for it to work. Any one thing really off is going to, cock the whole thing up, basically. So I would say that respect is one of the most important things. Okay. If people feel that they're respected, then that goes a long way. They're much less likely to respond emotionally. The other thing is, if you can give them a chance to save face, okay, that's one of the major things. And I think a large amount of the population have been manipulated. Yes, they should have known better. Yes, they should have been critically thinking better, but they didn't. They were manipulated in the head job. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars in propaganda. I think the few people that really don't have a leg to stand on are these pro-vax professors. It's their, as far as I'm concerned, I don't have a lot of time for when they refuse to look at data, they refuse to believe that they might be wrong in any way. So those guys, I think, are very. So when we look at the people believing in it, it's almost like we create a single person. But the truth is, there's so many different types of people, and some people have, more responsibility to have looked into the data than others. For instance, if you are administering a shot to someone, I think you have the responsibility to know the ingredients, the safety levels, all these things. But that's where incentives are very powerful. Human nature is incredibly vulnerable to manipulation.
Everything you take in with your senses, everything you hear, see, eat, and surround yourself with is programming you to succeed or fail. Over the past 5 years, we have all been subjected to an enormous amount of disempowering programming. If you're anything like me, you have experienced a point where all the information you were taking in was actually damaging your health, your relationships, your productivity, or all of the above. It's why I produce programming to empower people, and it's why I became a freedom from self-sabotage coach. We are living in extraordinary times, and we will either succumb to the constant negative programming or we will become alchemists and transmute our challenges into victories. We will become the people we've been waiting for. If you're interested in working with me, either in a group or one-on-one, as a coach or a speaker, just email me at Michelle with 2 L's and an E at gatheryourwits.com, and let's have a conversation. Now back to some empowering programming.
So how do you support people? How do you allow them, provide the space for them to save face?
Yeah, well, what I do is I will use a lot of words. I will basically try to imagine that they're part of humanity and I'm part of humanity, and humanity is under attack from some corrupt people. Okay, so I imagine that we're on the same side, and then I'll say things like, well, we've been misled, yeah, etc. Now that gives them a way to, and I said, if I showed you some example where you've been misled, would you be willing to change your mind? Things like, if you can get somebody to actually be open about that, then it feels comfortable to change. If someone lied to you about a piece of data and then you got the truth data, then you've got space to change your mind, haven't you? It's much easier. And that's the thing about rigid belief systems. Once you push against them, they will defend themselves. If you bombard them with facts, they're going to really push you back. And the problem is that you can take any single subject and you can find a study on either side to support either argument. That seems to be pretty common in everything now. And then and if you get into too much, because I had one guy that I was talking to who I'd met a few times, an acquaintance, and he really is the rudest, obnoxious person ever defending his position. But there was no amount of truth or reasoning or critical thinking that could reach that guy. He was just too far gone. And when I did actually corner him with some facts, he just blocked me. Okay, I'd led him into a position. So, because we didn't have a conversation where he was being respectful, etc., and I wasn't being respectful in response because he was being such an asshole. So the thing is, we don't listen to people in the out group. Okay, so you've got to find a way to get common ground. Okay, and that can happen in any way. What I've done in the past, I say to people, can I first just say that we're on the same side? And they go, what do you mean? I said, well, you care about humanity, your community. That's why you're here. I'm the same. We may differ on the facts. That changes the whole orientation of the conversation. Okay, because without realizing it, they are orientated. They are talking to the caricature of who they think you are. Okay. And that's the irony, is that the media has created this single persona to anyone that questions, and it doesn't make any sense. That's a funny thing, but it's so emotional that they're communicating to somebody that's low IQ. So, I mean, you've only got to look at the characters in the TV series when they were conspiracy theorists. They generally got a disability, low IQ, can't articulate their point, all these things. Usually white male in a certain age group, all these things. They've got this like caricature. Now the person is talking to that character without realizing they're talking to that character. Okay. What's the reality is there's thousands of different people that they're actually talking to. But when we're talking to a conditioned person, it is almost like talking to a caricature, because their belief system is based on an indoctrination of ideas. Okay, it's not reality.
As you said earlier, they're throwing out the same epithets, the same lines.
Yeah. It's literally word for word. I mean, I'll say something now, and I guarantee that you will know the punchline. Okay. The person says they've had their 8th booster. They just caught COVID, but
it could have been worse if I didn't get it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Now that's funny because it's true, but that's the level of conditioning. It's literally similar to McDonald's and all the chocolate bars and all these things, is that they create associations. Okay. And with enough programming, see, that's the interesting thing, that when you, particularly from your history, when you look at that NTT that we spoke about, which is narrative transportation theory, which is an example, the Harvard Alcohol Project got together with ABC Studios, and then they wrote the term designated driver into all the TV series in the 80s. So then it enters everyone's mind. So that's a form of conditioning. You could argue that that's a fairly decent form of conditioning to people not to drink and drive. But it doesn't stop there. Literally, you can't watch any TV series now without any of these main agendas popping up, usually multiple ones. Okay. Now so let me give you an example. So Jack gets off the bus. Okay. Jack walks into the town. There's outside a grocery store. Out walks a couple. There's a man and his wife. The man starts abusing the wife. Okay. And he gets quite, and it looks like he's going to be physical. And then Jack walks over and intervenes. Okay. And then the man apologizes and says he won't do it again. Okay. What do you think about Jack? What's Jack's character?
Well, he's a hero.
Yeah. And he protects women, and he's okay to stand up for what he believes in, etc. What do you think about the other man?
That he's a bully, a wimp, abusive.
Did I tell you any of that?
No.
That's implicit association.
And you're absolutely right. In fact, I'm going to say there's a series of books written. So my background, for those who don't know, is in television, and as an actor and a producer, director. So there was a series of books written called Save the Cat. And someone, a writer, had analyzed what works about creating a hero right away so that we believe him and follow him, right? So that no matter what he does, he can be abusive, he can be violent, whatever. But because he's done this one thing at the beginning, he has established that he's a good guy, right? So could be, and that is a save the cat, right? So essentially you have this guy, let's say he gets off a bus and there's a cat that's about to be run over and he pulls it out of the street. Well, now we're with him. It only takes one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Now what's really interesting there is you've prompted something that I noticed is what they then do is they get the character to do something immoral. And the person goes along with them. So what Jack does in the TV series, right? So basically they're getting you to bond to Jack. Okay. So Jack is a good guy. Interesting enough, he saved that woman, but he also saves a dog in an episode or two later. So you've got all the little. So what they're doing is they're getting you to emotionally bond to this character. And then what he does is he kills people in cold blood.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he's supposed to be a supporter of the law. So surely he should arrest that person and have them tried during a court. And of course, that's where it gets quite emotional because what if he's got the wrong person? That's the whole point of having laws and regulations and all these things to protect us from wrongdoings. And obviously, the courts now are, that's another story. But I've seen people in the freedom movement where they want to be judge, jury, and executioner. Okay, they want to be judge, dread. And now that, again, if the person has been, so let's say the propaganda has got you to dislike someone incorrectly, but you feel like you want to hurt that person. Okay, we can make a huge mistake. So I think a wise person realizes that we are all vulnerable, and therefore it's to have certain systems that protect us. Those systems have actually been corrupted to the core now. But you can't let someone's emotional opinion rule. It just doesn't work. I mean, we wrote an article recently, and it was based on the ship of Theseus, which is an old paradox of a riddle, which is if there's this ship, an old ship a few hundred years ago, made of wood, if every plank was replaced plank by plank, is it the same ship? See? Now there's the question. It's a tricky question. It's a tricky question on purpose. So what happens if they replace every facet of society, and they being like bankers and controller, whatever, replace them with one they control? But it was done plank by plank. You wouldn't notice. You would still think you were operating in a society that was built, and that's questionable anyway. But who's benefiting from these things? Yeah. So in the UK, we have simultaneously this BS cost of living crisis, okay, at the same time that all the big corporations are making record profits. Okay,
Well,
that doesn't
happen. Right. And your example before we started recording of putting up solar farms and then blocking out the sun.
Like both of those are obviously highly, well, the first one questionable, the second one is stupid, bordering on insanity. Yeah. So this is the thing, but most people are so implicitly feeling that they just have to trust the experts.
Okay, I know it's a big question. I want to ask, how do we move past that? But I want to ask a couple of, in a little more detail, which is what I've observed over the last 5 years. If you have all these people who, quote unquote, woke up, who could see, okay, the system is rigged. It is geared for certain people. All of these things are happening, and they have found a sense of purpose, and they are vocal and they are active, but now their egos are invested in this new purpose and this drive to tell the truth.
Yeah.
But then it becomes calcified, right? Because now they've become positional, and we're just creating something that's going to be a pendulum swing that just keeps the whole system, going back and forth, right? So that's the first bit. And the second bit is that, how do we stay ever vigilant? Because if we were fooled before, we are just as susceptible to be fooled again. It's not like we've got the answers, we've figured it out.
Well, that's one of the problems, is that people, when they think they spotted one lie, they think they're now immune to all the lies.
Yeah.
Staying vigilant is introspection. It's to monitor your own behavior, your own thoughts, and just apply the scientific method to it. Yeah. If you can question the thoughts that you have and the opinions and the positions that you take, and see, there's a really good process where it's called argue like a politician. And it's just, you jot down the various stances and you look at all the evidence for each of them.
It's such a simple idea. It's brilliant in its simplicity, and virtually nobody does that.
Well, that's the irony. When you looked at, there was I can't remember what I was watching. I was watching one video on YouTube about some kind of research, and the guy said, and it was a room full of accountants, and there's like 600 there, and he said, how many of you do a purchase product assessment, blah, 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 in your company? And they all put their hands up. And he says, how many of you did that when buying your car? And only 6 people kept their hand up. So there's something about, in the office, people do these things, but when it comes to their own life, they don't. Now, critical thinking requires active thought. Now, I remember when I was at and you have to remind me of his surname, Brian Peckford, is it?
Yes.
Yes. He's the last signatory of your declaration, Charter of Rights. Yeah. So he was saying, and it really brought it into my awareness, because up to that point I hadn't really given it much thought, but he said being a citizen requires a lot of work, requires a lot of input, a lot of effort. And of course, most people don't want to do that. So, of course, if you don't want to do that, then really you're just going to be subjective to whoever the bunch of gangsters are in town at the time. Yeah. But when people, see, that's the thing about purpose. When people start to do that and they start to the fulfillment from taking an active role in your destiny, then you go, hang on a minute. I need to think about this. I need to do something about this. Because there's, coming back to that why question, you just reminded me of a very key study where they went to a group of people, and it was around, I think it was party affiliation or political view, somewhere around that. And they said to them, why do you hold the view you hold? Or why do you support the current party, etc.? And then what happened was that they basically rationalized their position. And then they said, oh, can we donate to that cause on your behalf? And they said, yes, that'd be good. When they changed the question, can you explain the policies of that party, etc.? What happened was the person realized they didn't know. And then when they said, can we donate on your behalf? They said, actually, no, I need to give this some more thought. So I think what you're talking about, really, again, it comes back to implicit association, is that when my sister did this to me accidentally, she said to me, you always think you're right. And that caused me a really big problem when I thought about that, because I felt like I was, and now I realized that I couldn't be. So then I realized that that was conditioned, that feeling. So then that created this dissonance. So then we designed a question, which was, would you rather find the truth or be right? And that's really a lot of the time what it boils down to, is that if whatever goal someone's committed to, whatever intention is there, now it might be hidden. And that's the beauty of it in a group. If you can get down, and that's why, a mission statement, all these things works really well, because it's about working towards a shared goal that's fair to the people working on it. Now, when that gets explicitly stated, everything tends to change. And of course, you can slightly change that question, which anytime I had trolls on my social media that were nurses and doctors, it was very simple to ask them a question that shut them up most of the time. And it was this. It was, if hypothetically, if the policies you are following cause more harm than good, would you still follow them? Because what you're clashing there is that they're just doing as they're told, okay?
Yeah.
Because they haven't really looked into it. And you're basically challenging that they're pretending. And this comes back to that quote that says, there's two reasons for everything, a good reason and a real reason. Okay. Now, they're always going to give you the good reason, but if you challenge them for the real reason, okay, then that really can create dissonance, or a good dissonance. And that's where the propaganda was very powerful, and it gave people all these good reasons. I mean, they were all nonsense and built on no scientific foundation whatsoever. Like, why are you wearing your mask? To protect you. Why are you getting the jab? To protect you. It's like, well, what if it didn't? Which it doesn't. Well, why are you doing it? So, and this is what's interesting, because, and it only takes, so I think we need to be fair on ourselves, because it's only when we do, start to really think about this at a deeper level. So think about why someone would wear a mask. Okay. Now, if you assume they're wearing it because of safety, and you show them information on safety, but that's not why they're wearing it, then information won't make any difference. A lot of people were wearing it because everyone else were. So the propaganda was targeting. So there's one study that kind of highlights this, and they were trying to get people to use less energy. Now, obviously, the whole energy is a very charged debate as well. But let's just say that using less energy in this context was maybe I mean, we don't want to waste energy, do we? You know what I mean? It's one of those things. But yeah. Let's say that they were trying to get people to use less energy. Now, they messaged them about how much money they could save. That had no effect, or very little effect. They messaged them about how it would help whether it would help the environment, etc. That had no effect. But when they messaged them how much they use compared to their neighbors, that had massive effect. Okay. So what's going on there? And that's one of the things that people don't realize, is that drove a lot of people's behavior. And everyone to a T is going to say, oh, it wouldn't affect me. But see, this is the thing with hidden influence. We can see it affecting others, but we don't see it affecting ourselves because we don't feel it affecting ourselves. Now, that's why propaganda and influence becomes so stealth and so powerful, because you don't experience it, because it happens subliminally, below your awareness. Once you become aware of certain things that do it, like I know that if I go into an upmarket, shop or supermarket or whatever, little shop, I know that I'm probably going to spend a lot of money. Okay. There's something about those things that, so I first make sure I don't go in there when I'm hungry. So, you know what I mean? Because I just know that I end up, and that's the introspection, that I walk in there to buy one thing and I walk out with a big bag and a long receipt. And I'm like, what the hell happened?
Yeah, you're pointing to something that I want to touch on, and that is self-interest. Because I see that the self-interest of not wanting to waste money or spend money unnecessarily is really good incentive. And I think that what's possible is that, and I touched on this earlier, is that people see an opportunity in all of this because most people, you're right, don't want to engage in being a good citizen, don't want to engage because people are tired, right? They're busy, they work hard, they there's enough stress in the world. Like there's all the reasons not to be active as a citizen, right? But what if, or to speak out when things aren't in alignment with your values, right? To be not to be complicit or compliant. How do we focus on the opportunity? Because I think that that's one thing, as challenging, as difficult as I personally have found the last 5 years, there's also been this tremendous opening, this
Yeah.
opportunity. How do we focus on that?
Well, that's really looking at the bright spots. I mean, because I say to my clients, every time that you get emotionally triggered, the door is ajar. Okay, the door is ajar to look what's in that room, to find the source of it and remove it. Because then you start. It's a bit like if you walked out and the front garden had lots of landmines. Okay, and every time you stepped on one, it just reset and it just made a loud noise. For instance, you'd be constantly going through life with lots of loud noises. But if you rewired those or took them out, etc., then you're clearing your mind. So that's one thing about like self growth. But of course, what you've got, and this is one of the reasons of keeping everyone scared and in survival mode, is that people don't sit down and think about the future. It's always about the immediate. Now, this is the thing about goal activation that's quite startling, is that you may have values and you may have goals in your life. You can have a short-term goal that's activated in the opposite direction. Okay. Now, if that short-term, for instance, take someone wanting to lose weight. Okay. Now they've got goals. They want to be healthier, but they've got an association of food where they eat when they're stressed and they eat when they're triggered. And you've only got to walk down the street and you'll see 100 adverts and whatever. So the person's being constantly primed to activate that goal of eating food. So they're constantly moving away from that, from their long-term goal and values. The same thing happened during the last 5 years where people are constantly being threatened and scared and this crisis, that crisis. So they're never really able to plan. And of course, the other one is given bread and circus and they never revolt. But we're reaching a point now that the comfort levels for a lot of people are going to change. Okay. Now, when that happens, because most of the people, there's many reasons why people find their purpose to speak up, etc. And once they've got that kind of purpose and meaning, you can't really dissuade them from that. So when someone has a true purpose and their purpose, they feel like is speaking out or challenging the pharmaceutical companies, they're the people that the propagandists hate the most because you can't influence them. I remember Arthur Pawlowski on the stage when he was talking about they'd offered him a load of money. He said, well, you can't buy me. I've already sold myself to God, which was very interesting because, he's unreachable to corrupt in that line. And that's the thing where, it's a complex subject, but I think if people get more in touch with themselves, I think what most people don't do in the world that we live in is that cat.
Yeah.
Save the cat. Well, animals are fantastic for a start. I mean, but I think most people don't have a space to process the world. Phones are very problematic. They're like they create so much tension. you know. So I pretty much always have my notifications off. So we're just, you know, so create a bit of space in your life. I think that's key. A space between things, so you have that time, that downtime. I think processing. I think there's literally billions of people that have got unprocessed emotions over the last 5 years. I think that would be very wise to do. I think that community is pretty incredible. You know, people can start. The ones that are really successful is when the community comes together. They've got a shared goal. They start doing things that builds a community. They all benefit. All of those things. They're really, really powerful. I think that, yeah, people have to think about looking after themselves, you know, a bit of nurture. I mean, there's this term in psychology that's called post-traumatic growth. And what happens is that when you're traumatized and finding out that, you know, your government might be lying to you is quite traumatic, that you get a crossroads and you get post-traumatic stress or you get post-traumatic growth. And to get post-traumatic growth requires support from other people, a good community, all these things. So then what happens is that that map that I talked about gets completely destroyed. And then what you have is you have a blank canvas to create a new one. Okay, and that new one is really how you decide to build it. And I think what's important is that to have a bit of faith in humanity, you know, to find good people. That's why spending time around animals I find is always great, because they just have lovely nature. But I think one of the greatest manipulations of all is to get us to dislike humanity. I mean, the amount of people that say that they don't like people, etc., and it's understandable when a lot of these indoctrinated people are spouting up some nonsense, but we are vulnerable. And I think having some faith in humanity is so key, because it's almost like all of the agendas are just destroying, you know, are set out to destroy humanity almost, you know, and it is a time now where people could argue this has been going on for hundreds of years, and now it's becoming so obvious. And that's why so many people are becoming aware of it. And I think at that point, you know, it's to really question everything that we think, you know, am I really not good enough? Is that true? And you realize it's not true, but that's then when a lot of the time you may need to go through a process. And there's lots of great processes out there. I mean, I use the Lefko method, which I trained in, which is brilliant. Yeah, there's a really good book on that on Amazon, and you know, you find it on many booksellers. I think it's called. It's the Lefko method. I'm trying to think of the title. Something about
notes.
But there's lots of things. I like the Sedona method. I think EFT can be very effective with a good practitioner. But what it is, the key is that map. Okay, what's on the map will dictate a lot of our behavior and pretty much how we feel about ourselves. Yeah. So if somebody is conditioned to think that they're only good enough by getting 100% in the exam, you know, and as I said, I have a lot of clients that think I am bad, when it's like, you know, they know it's not true logically, but when it feels true, that's the thing that has to change.
I think I think what you're talking about, the work you're doing, is so vital. I think we have moved well beyond needing more information, like factual information to show people, you know, this is not about that. This is about what people have been indoctrinated to believe, people's attachment to what they believe on whatever side. And you sent me this gorgeous list of things, and we've hardly touched on them, but I think that I'd like to encourage people to to check out your website, to take your courses, because every conversation I've had with you, and we've had several, has been so rich and so full of not just information, but like powerful, mind expanding, useful information. So how can people find out about what you do? Tell me what's coming up. This episode will air this month, so if that's helpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's what comes back to purpose. So I kind of feel like my purpose now is to look through all this data on behavioral science and how we work, basically, how communication operates, and then share it with people. Now, I don't have any funders or backers, but so I can say whatever I want. I'm there's no association telling me what I can and can't say. So that's why I think that it's sort of liberated in that way. And that's my purpose. So I spend pretty much all the day doing that, and I see the odd client to, put some food on the table for me and my dog Samantha. And we've got a few interesting things coming up. There's a series of workshops coming up in a few weeks, and it's called the Thinking Society. And I got together with Dr. David Funder and Sinead Stringer, who's a behavioral scientist, and David is a political philosopher. And it's literally, how do we create a society that works for the people? Okay, that's bottom up, not top down. And that's really key. We've got a lot of workshops coming up. We're just about to, hopefully in 3 or 4 weeks, publish the book on propaganda, which is like a dictionary of propaganda. And there's going to be a lot of quizzes and stuff that you can really become familiar with it and spot it much better. But people can go to the website, and if they scroll down on the home page, they can sign up for the free Zooms, which we do every couple of weeks. And the last one was on questions, and which was that, don't ask the why question. Questions are very interesting. When you start to understand the response that certain questions get, then you develop very quickly the ability to ask questions that will get you people to start thinking. Because a lot of the time they're not thinking, they're reacting, as you pointed out. And you don't really want them to react, because all they're doing is reacting from their conditioning. So yeah, that's what we're looking to do, is just to be a kind of resource for anyone that wants to do what they want to do and be more effective at, whether it's campaigns, whether it's because it looks like a one-way street. There's more people becoming aware than people that are. In fact, there's not anyone that becomes unaware. The speed at which we have to go is to go faster than the indoctrination of the new generation. That's where we need to act, because the indoctrination of the current people at school is reaching epic proportions. I mean, they've got the indoctrination down now. To think that a man can have a baby and a woman can have a penis is truly something astonishing. You know what I mean? 10 years ago, if you'd have said, can you get people to believe this? You'd have thought that's not possible, but literally that's what they managed to do.
It is astonishing, the things they've got people to believe. I mean, even, just yesterday, I was in a restaurant. There was a Sunday brunch buffet, and a man kept putting his mask on to go up to get food.
Yeah, it's they don't question why. It's a real compliance thing, isn't it? I guess one thing I'd say to the viewers is, you're not alone. Okay, it's part of the agenda is to make people feel isolated and that they're the only ones, but you're not. There's millions of people, and you really want to find a place where you can talk to people. And that's one of the things. We need these places where we can get support without criticism, because criticism is fairly common, that everyone's criticizing everyone all the time. And pretty much social media posts are most people defending themselves and criticizing others. But I think we've got to realize, we can disagree, but still be on the side of humanity. Okay. And if you're dimming the sun and destroying farmers and injecting people with things that don't work, that isn't the side of humanity. Okay. And that's really, for me, what it is. You're either on the side of humanity or they're not. And the ones that are on the side of humanity, then we can sit down and talk about the details of it, and then, even agree to disagree, but still move in the right way. And a big part of the propaganda is to get us to fight each other, because then we're too busy fighting each other and not realizing that there's a bunch of criminals taking all the wealth and the money and the things, behind our backs.
I think that's so true. And I want to ask you one last question, but I just want to comment on that, because, that agenda to fight each other, I think, is so powerful. And I think it's one of our biggest challenges, that we need to remember that we are on the side of humanity. We will disagree about details, how to do things, even certain facts. We'll disagree, but that it's so true, because what I find is that, I was attacked online by someone a scientist on our side because of a guest I had. And it was so visceral. And I was just like, I just want to, that's when I want to quit. Now I don't, because I recognize I'm having an emotional reaction in the moment. It will pass. I'm sensitive. Okay. Um, but it's just that. It's just, I love what you said. We are all on the side of humanity. The last question
Yeah.
I have for you, and you can add anything you want to add, but the last question is, how do you stay in that state? What keeps you going to keep doing this?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and yes, I'm pretty sure that everyone's thought about quitting and giving up and all those things, and it's to give yourself permission to feel that way. It really is that you're going to have tough days and you're going to have really good days, and I think a lot of it, from what I can see from the work that I do with clients, is if you just honor how you feel, you give yourself space to feel that. You don't fight it. You give yourself permission to, then it processes really quickly. It's really astonishing that, I've had it where I can feel really down one day, and particularly I find that if I spend too much time debating and indoctrinating people online, then it can get me down a little bit. And then what I do is, I mean, my dog's a brilliant way to spend time, but I think I find a way that when I sit with how I feel and I allow myself to process that and release it, then I get a lot of peace. Okay. And for me, I do love the work of the Sedona method, like Lester Levinson, when I look at what he managed to, a lot of the time suffering is fighting how things are. Okay. But when you just accepting them, is surrendering isn't giving up. Surrendering is just saying, right, this is how it is right now. And then what you're doing is you're just acknowledging that. And then, of course, what happens is that I think you find this inner strength. So what pushes me on, I don't think is me deciding to do it. Okay. I think it's just this innate push to realize that this is my calling, as it were, and everyone's got theirs. And getting the noise out of the way. So allowing myself to make mistakes, allowing myself to do silly things and all that, and being my own friend in that respect, I think is what allows me to find that peace. And just talking about that now kind of reminds me of that when I do that, that's when things flow. Okay. And it doesn't happen all the time, and that's okay.
Thank you so much. I could talk to you for hours. As always, I will talk to you again.
Well, I'm
And
fortunate. The subject is very rich.
yeah, no kidding. This is just, it's so delicious, this whole thing. And I really hope that what people take away is their own introspection, their own, like, using these tools that you're talking about, these methods, these practices.
And the
Because,
introspection is key as well.
right.
See, so that's
Just
the thing, because introspection is limited. That outrospection is observing yourself, observing your patterns, observing your. Once you start to do that, I mean, even observing the way people react to your questions is brilliant. That's an outrospection, and I think that's that's so cool. And I think that, I think humanity, there's a lot, we're facing a lot of challenges, but a lot of it is based on manipulation. Okay. And if we just find ourselves and connect with each other and, form these communities, then the nonsense that's being pushed wouldn't stand a chance.
Thank you for your wisdom and for your time and for your calling.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I just honor everyone out there that knows what's going on. I say, you're not alone, and, just do what you know to be right.
We can disagree, but still be on the side of humanity. I love that quote. In the quest for peace and justice, life and liberty, we would do well to remember this. It was over 2 years ago that I first wrote about how the freedom movement could destroy itself. I was alarmed and dismayed that so many good people could turn on each other. We get so caught up in the how of what we're striving for that we forget the why. We allow the righteousness of our egos to override the context of our commonality. Those of us who stand for truth and freedom are all on the side of humanity. When we allow our differences to divide us, those who work to suppress us win. This is the first of so many takeaways from my conversation with David Charalambous. My second takeaway is that we are all susceptible to propaganda. No one is immune. Those of us who have been willing and able to see the manipulation behind the curtain are no less vulnerable. As David said, propaganda happens subliminally, beyond our consciousness, which is why everyone thinks it doesn't work on them. Knowing this means that we are never done examining our beliefs and actions. Critical thinking isn't something that happens once and is handled. Being awake doesn't mean that we're never asleep again. Exercising our faculties requires just as much regularity as exercising our bodies. And understanding psychological manipulation, fifth-generation warfare, mind control, propaganda, this is, for better or worse, part of what is required in the world in which we live. That doesn't mean that we need to be paranoid, untrusting, or even afraid. It means that we have an opportunity to be open to continued growth and understanding of who we are as human beings and as a society. Because ultimately, real transformation starts within. And transforming the world will require a great deal more than replacing key players. Finally, there is the powerful idea and techniques for triggering curiosity, guiding people towards discovering their own cognitive dissonance and letting them save face, as David suggests. Facts and figures have not been enough to change the minds of the indoctrinated. If we are to create the world in which we wish to live, we will also need compassion and creative communication. Thankfully, David Charalambous is providing ways in which to cultivate both. I highly recommend checking out his work and courses at reachingpeople.net. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation and will join me for more. If you'd like, share your insights in the comments section and please hit the subscribe button. Stay tuned, be true to yourself, and remember that we are the ones we've been waiting for.